Hi Logic students, this week we begin our study of fallacies. In this video I will introduce fallacies and I will explain the distinction between formal fallacies and informal fallacies. And in the rest of the course we will study primarily informal fallacies. So what is a fallacy? A fallacy is basically a flaw in an argument. It's the defect that makes the argument invalid if the argument is deductive, or weak if the argument is inductive. And many of the typical flaws that occur in arguments have been studied and cataloged. So there's a whole branch of logic that deals primarily with fallacies. Now, why do we want to study fallacies? Well, there are many benefits to studying fallacies. First, you will see that many people commit fallacies. There are lots of examples from our textbook and the exercises that are real-life examples. So you will recognize some of the typical fallacious arguments that we will discuss as arguments that you've heard in the media or in speeches of politicians, in advertising, etc., etc. So it's a very real-life sort of topic. Second, if you're aware of what can go wrong in an argument, then you will be able to stay away from it. So studying fallacies will also help you avoid them, and in this way the quality of your own arguments when you write your papers or discuss something in class will increase. I mentioned before that there are two types of fallacies, the formal fallacies and the informal fallacies. So we need to go into an explanation of the distinction. What is a formal fallacy? A formal fallacy is basically a structural flaw in an argument. So the elements of the argument are not bad in themselves, but it's the way that they're put together that causes the argument to go bad. So the problem is the structure. You may compare this to having, say, great ingredients for making a pizza, but you put them together in the wrong way. So if you put the cheese at the bottom and the crust and tomato sauce over the cheese, you basically don't get a pizza. You get this horrible mess with all this burned cheese on the bottom. So the ingredients may be very good taken individually, but if they're put together in the wrong way, the result is necessarily bad. For example, take this argument. All mammals are warm-blooded, all dogs are warm-blooded, therefore all dogs are mammals. Here there's nothing wrong with the statements. The statements are all true, but they are arranged according to a structure that makes the argument invalid. Let's see how that is. You know from section 1.5 in our textbook how to discover the form of the argument. So let's look at the form of this argument. Again, all mammals are warm-blooded, all dogs are warm-blooded, therefore all dogs are mammals. The structure, the form of the argument is all M are W, all D are W, therefore all D are M. And then once you have extracted the form, you can quickly realize that it's an invalid form by composing a counterexample. Sorry, a counterexample. So here it is. This counterexample shows that the form is invalid. You can use that form to make an argument that is very clearly an invalid argument because it has true premises and the false conclusion. So, for example, you could build this argument on that form. All Chicago Bulls players are men. All Los Angeles Lakers players are men. Therefore, all Los Angeles Lakers players are Chicago Bulls players. So clearly the premises are true, the conclusion is false. This exposes that the structure of this argument is invalid, the form is invalid. So the argument that we started out with, all mammals are warm-blooded, all dogs are warm-blooded, therefore all dogs are mammals, was invalid. But the problem was not in the statements that constituted the argument. Those were perfectly good statements. The problem was the arrangement of those statements, the form or the structure. So if you take those statements and rearrange them in the correct way, in accordance with a valid form, then you get a valid argument. All dogs are mammals, all mammals are warm-blooded, therefore all dogs are warm-blooded. That is a valid argument. So the one at the top is fallacious. The one at the bottom has the same elements but arranged in accordance with a valid form. So it is a valid argument. The fallacy was formal. It had to do with the structure of the argument. What is the informal fallacy? We looked at the formal fallacy or the formal fallacy type. What is an informal fallacy? An informal fallacy is a flaw not in the structure of a piece of reasoning, but in the elements themselves of the reasoning. If you make a pizza with rotten cheese and ketchup in place of the tomato sauce, you will get a bad pizza even if you arrange the crust, the ketchup, and the cheese in the proper order. And similarly, when an argument commits an informal fallacy, there's something rotten with the components of the argument. No rearranging of those elements will ever yield a good argument. Here's an example from our textbook. Suppose that somebody says, television entertainer Bill Maher argues that religion is just a lot of foolish nonsense, but Maher is an arrogant, shameless, self-righteous pig. Obviously, his arguments are not worth listening to. So this is the argument. And in this argument, the conclusion is that we should not listen to Bill Maher's arguments. But the reasons were given for believing the conclusion basically consist in a series of insults against Bill Maher himself. One may certainly legitimately disagree with Bill Maher or anybody, but in order to reach legitimate conclusions, one must present acceptable evidence. If you show where exactly Bill Maher goes wrong in his arguments, then you have a legitimate point. But if you just throw some mud at him, some insults, hoping that they stick, then you're not really making a good argument, of course. Incidentally, this example that we just looked at is one of the fallacies of relevance, which is the first group of fallacies that we're studying this week. The fallacies of relevance are all those logical errors that consist in relying on premises that are not relevant to the conclusion. For example, all the insults piled up against Bill Maher in the example that we have just discussed are irrelevant. They have no bearing on whether his arguments are good or bad. So a conclusion about the arguments should be reached through an examination of the arguments, not through a series of insults against the person. This fallacy is called ad hominem argument. Ad hominem means against the person. It's a Latin expression that means against the person. I hope that you will enjoy learning about this fallacy and the other fallacies of relevance this week. It's all in the textbook. There are various different fallacies of relevance, and I hope that this video clarified the distinction between a formal and an informal fallacy. And I look forward to our discussions. Thank you.